Thank you all so much for being flexible with us and moving to this online format. We just want to make sure that everyone is safe and healthy, and that people can still access all the information that they need. So just to start us out, of course, we always want to thank our lead dog sponsor, Western Health, for making Big Day of Giving possible. And also, before we begin, I wanted to address, I know that we've heard from many of you and many of our nonprofit partners that the current events are greatly affecting both your fundraising, your ability to, provide services and continue to do your work. And we hear you. We are putting together some resources and responses to the current events and to address your concerns. So stay tuned for that. We're also looking, in light of everything, at doing potentially a webinar. So we're talking to some nonprofit leaders about doing a webinar next week about the current situations and the issue of fundraising and everything right now. So if you have any questions or things that you would want to talk about on that webinar, we're going to start a thread on the learning community, so you can post your concerns or what you want to cover there. We know that our nonprofits cover a very large variety of what they serve, so we might not so much focus on direct services and specifically what you do, but more fundraising and the issue of funding right now. Also, just a real quick reminder, we want to make sure that everyone is really clear with their donors that Big Day of Giving is still happening. You might be postponing an in-person event, but I can think of no better time for an online giving day. So we want to make sure that everyone knows that Big Day of Giving is still happening. We want lots of participation. Now more than ever, it's a great time to give to nonprofits. So be clear with everyone that May 7th is still the best day to give to nonprofits. So with that, I want to start out by introducing today's presenter. So we have Steve Wise, who is president of Wise Group. Steve is a seasoned business strategist who's worked extensively in the public, private, and nonprofit sector. He is former board chair of both KBIE and Cap Radio, and he's been on the board of Sutter Davis Hospital and American Leadership Forum, and I'm sure that I'm also forgetting other ones that he's been on the board of, so please correct me, Steve, if I'm wrong. And he is also certified as a governance trainer by BoardSource, so needless to say, he knows a lot about board engagement, and we're really excited to have him. So thank you so much for being with us, Steve, and I'll hand it over to you.
Terrific. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for making the time and effort to join us in this webinar format. Certainly, I think we all would have appreciated the opportunity to meet face-to-face and give you the opportunity to ask your questions and to spend time with each other and visit as you look at the activities for the next few months with your nonprofit as you get ready for Big Day of Giving and beyond. But in light of the health circumstances, there's probably no better place for nonprofit leaders than to gather your strength and spend time following public health guidelines, so that if there's one sector that's going to be needed more than ever, it's going to be the nonprofit leadership sector. With that in mind, although I'm disappointed I won't meet you face to face today, I hope that we'll find another opportunity to do so. And please feel free throughout the presentation to type up any questions that you have, and Monica will read those throughout, and I'll be happy to do my best to address those today during our webinar. I also realize that you're all busy people, and when we put this together, the thought of board engagement was top of mind as you looked at your learning, and maybe there are other things that are top of mind today, but you can feel comfortable and rest assured that the information that I'm going to share is evergreen, and it will have a value outside of being used immediately. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump right in to my presentation and comments. And as I said, please feel free to ask questions throughout. So what I'd like to do today during our time together is talk about board engagement, and I think really that means becoming a high-performing board. I know in looking at the registration list, some of you are board volunteers, some of you are staff volunteers, and some of you are professional members of the leadership team for your nonprofit. And I hope my comments will be relevant for all of you as you look at your role either as a staff member or as a volunteer or someone who's aspiring to be a board a leader. So we're going to talk about what it means to become a high-performing board. And one of the first things we need to look at is who's on the bus, and that's the Jim Collins book, From Good to Great, but this thought of who's actually going to be helping us accomplish the mission and the work that we're doing. And one of the keys, I think, to being a high-performing board is also looking at creating a constructive partnership. We'll talk about that between the professional leadership, the executive director, as well as the volunteer board leadership. What is the power of board engagement? What will that unleash and allow an organization to accomplish? And certainly on all of our minds, because financial stability, financial resources are critical to accomplishing the mission for any nonprofit organization. And so we're going to spend time at the end specifically talking about successful fundraising. So with that in mind, there's a visual, hopefully, that you can see that comes from BoardSource. As Monica mentioned, I have been certified by BoardSource on corporate governance. And I really liked this when I went through the training 5 or 6 years ago. As you see on this grid, on the bottom of it, absent, present, and engaged on that horizontal axiom. And on the other are 4 words: dysfunctional, functional, responsible, and exceptional. And this is sort of a self-test for you to look at the organization that you're involved with. Of course, we all aspire to be exceptional, to anticipate, to plan, to see opportunities that our nonprofit can take advantage of, and that through our strategic planning, good staff hiring, and the execution of our mission, that we can be in that top quadrant to look at exceptional. My guess is that some of you have, I know I have had experiences either being on a board or working with organizations that unfortunately are in that dysfunctional at the base of this diagram. And when you look at that base of that diagram, it shows you, and that's in that dysfunctional piece, that there's disengagement or there's conflict. This manifests itself where board members don't show up to meetings. There's open tension. Things are not really working the way that we had thought that they should. You move up that ladder and there's functional. That really the board is of no real consequence. If they showed up and there's a quorum, terrific. If they don't, it doesn't really matter. The organization is self-sufficient. The staff is running the organization, and things get done. We approve the minutes, the committees meet, but there's really no substantive work that's being done of consequence. Responsible is one more step up that rung. We're compliant. We're not going to be written up. Our audits aren't going to come back with problems. That there's a responsible board at play. But I think to have the level of board engagement that we want to unleash, it requires us to go one step higher, and that is to that place of exceptional, where we anticipate, we plan, we see opportunity, and there's wide board engagement. And so I'm going to spend all of the rest of our time today looking at that exceptional piece. How is it that you as a board can perform in a way that has you really moving on all cylinders? And that's focused on board engagement and a high-performing board that fulfills the organization's mission, that achieves its goals, and that it improves the lives of others, because we're focusing on not individual benefit of board members, but the collective good of the organization. So it starts with who's on the bus. And there's a great book by Jim Collins, Good to Great. There's actually a smaller monotype, if you haven't read it, that is specifically addressed for the nonprofit sector, and I highly recommend it. And it talks about the key elements and ingredients to be a top performing organization. And all of the reading that I've done and all of the work focuses on who is actually on the bus. And by that, I mean who should be leading this organization, and what do we need from them and want from them in a board member? What are the responsibilities that we have for them as board members? Are we clear about our expectations? How do we ensure that those people who are on the bus leading this board, working for this organization, represent our stakeholders and the community at large? And critical is, how do we create meaningful experiences for the board so that they want to engage with more time, more energy, and more involvement than pulling themselves back as their tenure on the board continues, and each month we see less of them or they're less involved. And so it really starts with looking at that, who is on the bus. Boards are only as effective as their individual members. A board is a collection of a lot of different people, and the success, no matter how you're organized, what committees, what subcommittees you have, all focus on the individual members' contributions. And so I think for a board to be successful, the next thing I'm going to say might not be popular, but I think it requires organizations to periodically do a check on do we have the right people on our board. For some organizations, if you don't have term limits, which I think in the case of nonprofit governance, term limits have tremendous value and are important and a best practice. I won't make this a political presentation, but I think in the case of nonprofit boards, term limits are a valuable and important tool. That I think it's also okay when board members' terms are up to not automatically reappoint them. It's okay to say goodbye to some board members and to have them move on. It doesn't mean they end their relationship or affiliation with our organization, but it does mean that their seat can be open to a new representative, a new leader who can propel the organization forward and bring a different point of view and set of experiences and perspective. Certainly all those exits should be well thought out and graceful, allowing people to keep their respect and dignity and appreciate them for their time. But as we look at the topic board engagement, and we're going to talk about fundraising, I want to set the right foundations. And so I want to be clear up front, and I'm happy to take questions if you have it, but I think we have to have the right table set for an organization to succeed. And the most critical place to start with is the thinking about who we've recruited to be on the board, the expectations we've set, and then one step further is the evaluation process for those board members that have either lost interest, it's a bad fit, they don't have the time, there's burnout, and the time is right to re-examine their participation. So with that in mind, if we have the right board, and I've seen, I'll be clear, I've been on boards where there's a chemistry and a rhythm and a flow, and a few board members term out, and a few new board members join on, and even just one new board member can sometimes change in a very significant way the culture and the pace and the feel of a board, and can help realign board member performance and expectation. It can sometimes just start with changing out one board member, not in a willy-nilly fashion, I'm not advocating that, but in a thoughtful way. And I think a regular board evaluation process is important.
So Steve, before you continue, we did have a question regarding culling bad board members. Have you ever seen some good practices for saying goodbye to disengaged members and still keep that person involved and feeling good about the organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult topic to figure out how to do this successfully. And I think the first piece is that this is the role of either the governance committee or board affairs chair or the board chair itself. I don't think it's the role of the CEO or the executive director, because these are peer-to-peer relationships, and the board is a volunteer board, and there's a board chair, and he or she, I think, needs to take a lead role. One of the practices that I've seen and experiences that takes place is, in many cases, the board member realizes they're not at peak performance. Events maybe have unfolded in their life that this isn't the priority it was initially. And so I think just having that open conversation to ask them, how do you think it's going, to get their sense, and to have that open dialogue without putting ultimatums or threats, but really beginning a constructive dialogue. And it might be, you know, to raise the issue with what's keeping you from attending more meetings. We've seen that you're not, you know, contributing like you used to. And that dialogue by itself might allow the board member to step down. Or alternatively, there might be a plan put in place, you know, let's commit over the next 3 months or 6 months or 9 months to the following that you can feel comfortable with. And that sort of kind of path, you know, I realize these aren't employees. And when I worked at the Sacramento Bee, for those who don't know, that's a newspaper. Actually, it's a newspaper that's in bankruptcy right now. Anyway, when I worked at the Bee, I had a team of about 25 folks, and I was the vice president of marketing and public affairs. And I can't think of if there was a single employee I let go in that time, but there were a number of employees that resigned because I had open heart-to-heart conversations with them about performance expectations and what was expected. Now, I realize the board isn't being paid and it's not the same responsibility, but it's that approach and orientation that I would encourage to be taken, but it would be best, in my mind, from the board leadership. Okay, other questions, Monica? Or I'll move on to the second piece of this, constructive partnership.
Nope, it looks like we're good right now.
So the next piece is to creating a constructive partnership, and that is a partnership between the board and the chief executive or the executive director, whatever the terminology is for the organization. And this is a model that I like from governance as leadership, and it's partnership through engagement. And you can see that there are 4 quadrants here. In that bottom left is governance as attendance, and that is, you're probably familiar with this. And as you can see, the axes here, I think this is the last of the charts that I have that have axes. So for those who are shuddering with thoughts of geometry or algebra or too many boxes or charts, this is, I think, the last of these. Anyway, executive director engagement is on that left axis, and it shows in executive director at the bottom of that would be not involved at all, and at the top of that is where they're highly involved. And the board engagement is on the far left, is the board is not engaged, and the far right is the board is highly engaged. And like most models, you want to play in that upper right axes, governance as leadership. So you can, again, step back and look at your own situation. And this is one of the first checks that I would do, a gut check, and visually see play out through, you know, through some observation with a nonprofit that I would work with. Governance as attendance is that the executive director is going through the motions with the board, but nobody is really that engaged in this organization. And those are not high-performing organizations. But equally troubling to me is at the top of that far left, governance as observation. The executive director is so good, is so competent in the work that they're doing, that they really displace the board. And there's really not much of an opportunity for the board to participate because they see that things are going fine. And in fact, what happens is they stop attending board meetings and they just turn the organization over to the executive director. Now, I'm sure there aren't any executive directors on the call who would say, you know, that might not be the worst thing to allow me not to have a board that micromanages and allow me to go full speed ahead and do what we need to do. And we'll check in with you when we need to. But that's really not a best practice. At the same point, to that same executive director, they often don't want to work in that far right box, which is governance as micromanagement. And that is that the executive director is not engaged because the board is doing everything. Now, I realize for those of you today who are from organizations that don't have a professional staff, this isn't as relevant or appropriate conceptually. But for those that have a professional paid staff, governance as micromanagement is when that staff feels like we can't do anything without getting the sign off and buy-in and check-in from our board leadership. And as a result, sometimes then you're not getting the full value out of your professional staff. And the best place to play, is, as I mentioned, is then really this top box, governance as leadership, that's in red. And that is where the executive director is charging with all cylinders in consultation, in a constructive partnership with the board, in setting agendas, in framing up strategic issues, in engaging with the board, in engaging with the organization in a way that there truly is a communication that's ongoing, clarity of expectations, a respect for unique roles, and choosing a CEO or an executive director is, I would argue, one of the most significant board decisions that has major implications. Hiring top flight staff that executive director brings into the organization. Critical, because these are the folks who are going to carry out that mission day in and day out. However, for an organization to truly be successful, effective boards need to be in place, and it's that constructive partnership that allows us to be successful.
So Steve, you mentioned a board evaluation process, and we got a question about what that would look like.
So a couple options. One is a self-evaluation to allow on an annual basis at a retreat or at a board meeting, to allow board members to sort of self-evaluate with a set of criteria and open-ended. I'm a big fan of face-to-face conversations, maybe not this week, but that allows the board chair to sit down individually with board members on an annual basis to go over their concepts and thoughts on the self-evaluation, and also for the board chair to provide candid feedback and leadership. Does the board member have an accurate perception of what others are experiencing? And using that as well to set individual goals for the year ahead. I don't see it done in a group setting in terms of individual performance, but I do like, and when I do retreats with organizations, I like to put on the agenda, how are we doing? Let's evaluate our performance collectively as a board, and where have we been really pleased with our progress and success, and where do we think as a board we're not hitting all those strides, and to ask the executive director in a constructive, candid way to provide feedback to the board as well on what the staff needs or needs that are being unmet, and to have, again, a constructive dialogue. There's more formal mechanisms Board Source has, documents, you can use those, but I wouldn't make it any more complicated than it needs to be.
Great.
So with the notion of sort of, performing at the board level that we want, then the next piece of this is to look at focusing specifically on, can we go back on a few slides? For some reason, it's pulling right in, Monica. There was a quote that would be great. I seem to have lost the driver tool there.
Oops, sorry.
That's all right. We'll go back a few more slides. Those who like to look ahead, you've got a nice preview. Here we go. Cindy Fickelstein, who is a Dartmouth business professor, wrote, and I really like this: I'm completely convinced that the biggest differentiator between high quality boards and weaker boards is the extent to which they actually engage in real debate. And I think that that is really an accurate assessment. As I work with organizations, when I have the opportunity to attend their board meetings, it really gives me a sense in a very short time to see what's happening. And when I served as the board chair, for some local boards, I really worked hard to create an environment that there was a purpose to show up to the meeting. It wasn't just a series of share presentations and listen to staff, and from that we'll will then check out at the end of the board meeting, but that there needed to be ways for the board to be engaged. And so with that in mind, I want to jump into now, people love top 10 lists. For those of us who used to watch David Letterman and his top 10 list, or wherever you see them, I've got this idea of 10 board engagement ideas. And these are things that you can bring to life, I hope, when the time is right into your own organization. I don't expect you to succeed at all 10 immediately, but they're sort of 10 ideas that will push this idea of board engagement forward. The first is to be strategic, and this isn't a session on strategic planning. I do a lot of work with organizations on strategic planning because I think that helps create a framework to have a constructive partnership, to clearly articulate what the board is best at, which is big thinking on vision and values and goals and strategies, and it also allows the staff then a really clear roadmap of where the organization is heading. And I don't think strategic planning is a one and done type of activity. I think it needs to be revisited. I think it needs to be relooked at. And as a result of that, organizations should be strategic, and the board, this is the place we want them to focus. The boards should not be as tactical necessarily. The ideal is for them to be looking at strategy. For those that need to be strategic and on a day-to-day, then that gives you you know, a focus on the day-to-day tactics, but also to step back and to be strategic. The second is to be clear on expectations. So again, as I said, I've got 10 of these board engagement ideas. Feel free if you have questions as I cover each of these, I'm happy to stop. When we talked about getting the right people on the bus, it also means being clear on what we're asking people to do and what are the expectations of a board member. And I've seen all too often in a haste and desire to recruit new board members that the new board member really never got a fair sense of what was expected of him or her when they join the board. What are the expectations? What are the financial, time, committees, meetings, schedule? And I just think that that should be really explicitly spelled out at the outset to avoid any misunderstandings. The third is to not forget the why. Simon Sinek wrote a terrific book about why, and you know, it's not the what, it's the why that gets to people's heart. Start with Why was the name of his book. You know, Martin Luther King had a dream, he didn't have a plan. Strategic planning is important, but all of you as volunteers who give time and money and endless effort, as nonprofit leaders who give tremendous time and energy and probably working below your economic value in the private sector, have chosen this because you have a commitment to the mission and the vision of your organization. And it goes without saying, but it gets overlooked, and that is to spend time thinking about why are we doing this? Why is this important? And to reiterating that it's a way to connect with staff, it's a way to connect with those who use your services, and it's a way to connect with your organization's donors. And for boards, it's particularly important to not just review the financials, and not just talk about the upcoming gala or activities or the big day of giving expectations, but to make sure we step back and we think of the why. In a prior life, I served as the director for the program that morphed in, or grew in, I should say, to the Mondavi Center for the Arts. I was the building chair for the Mondavi Center for the Arts and part of the fundraising team. But for many years before that, I was the director of university cultural programs at UC Davis, bringing an array of artists and lectures in Freeborn Hall and across campus and in Sacramento. And one of the things that I think of when I think of Don't Forget the Why, we would do a series of matinee events and we brought school children into the campus, many who had never attended, stepped foot on a university campus. So there was that powerful benefit, but many of them, of course, have also never had the opportunity to interact face-to-face with a company like Dance Theater of Harlem, or Wynton, hear from a jazz trumpeter like Wynton Marsalis. And I remember there was a corporate funder that was looking at maybe supporting our program. And I said, you know, we'd love your support, but before you make that decision, it's really important to me that you join me for one of the matinees. And so that person came to the Wynton Marsalis masterclass, where Wynton Marsalis played his trumpet and talked about jazz and his life. And this individual left with such a different appreciation of the work we are doing, seeing firsthand that interaction with students, young students of all ages, and this remarkable individual. And it changed their belief of the work we are doing and their investment level, quite candidly. And so I know it's not the same for each organization, but I think it illustrates the importance of really connecting with that why and not taking that for granted. The next tip and idea for board engagement is to find meaningful opportunities. And I just shared one focused on young students, K through 12, coming to a live arts performance in a theater. But there are meaningful opportunities that I've also seen. I worked with a community college foundation, and they brought into their board meeting one of the student scholarship winners who received funding for books and for emergency needs at the beginning of that semester. And again, this college foundation was aware of the contributions they were making and the contributions they were seeking, but to see it firsthand, I've seen this take place again with a crisis nursery, where individuals are seeing firsthand services being delivered, the power and impact of that mission being carried out. And I think to create those opportunities for board members to do that outside of just a staff member's presentation or a set of charts and numbers is really important. And the fifth, and we'll take a moment here, and again, please feel free. I'm really wish we had the opportunity to engage face-to-face, but I don't want that to hold back questions that you might have. But conduct board meetings that are worth attending. And you know, I think many of us perhaps have been in this situation. Monica, if you wouldn't mind going back to the image, that would be great. For some reason, it jumped ahead. But you know, ensure board meetings don't become board meetings. And this idea of people who are kind of, you know, showing up a few minutes late, leaving a few minutes early, making their grocery list while they sit at the board meeting, but really feel like the meeting goes on and their participation is not that critical. We could spend the entire hour talking about strategies for board meetings to be a more engaging opportunity for individuals to participate. Suffice it to say, I think it requires all of us to look at the agendas that we've set up for the board meeting, to ensure that they're done in consultation with board leadership, to make sure that there's time for real meaningful discussion and debate, sometimes maybe just on one strategic issue after you go through the board business that needs to be done. Consent calendars and agendas are another way to get some of the meetings done. And then I'm a big believer in using committees, so some of the more in-depth discussions on particular topics can be teed up there. So I could say a lot more about this. I want to move on because there's other content, but if you had any questions on these first sort of, you know, 5 thoughts and ideas as we look at board engagement ideas, but really look at that conducting board meetings that are worth attending.
So we do have one question regarding presentations. For those of us who plan to present at board meetings about engaging in the BDOG campaign, what is the best way to ensure that the presentation is engaging?
I think that to have a board member be part of that presentation, I think is important, as opposed to just a staff member sharing that. To have maybe a few people share parts of the presentation so you have more voices and different people standing forward, and to, you know, provide materials so that you don't have to go through all the depth and detail at that meeting itself. So as we look beyond the board meetings, I can't say enough about onboarding and ongoing board training. Creating the right experience for board members as they sign up really sets a tone. And that there is ongoing board training, and that doesn't have to be something that just happens once a year at the retreat. There could be opportunities throughout the year. It could be in small groups. I've worked with one board where they just said, we're in groups of 3 or 4 or 5, so it doesn't disrupt the day-to-day operations. We're going to ask board members to gather. It's a good team building for those small groups, but it also provides ongoing board training. It might include speakers to the full board. I have been on the Capitol Public Radio board for many years and just termed off. And one of the things that we all looked forward to at the retreat was bringing in an external speaker that had a lot of perspective and expertise that they could share about the media world, about public radio specifically, but sometimes broader than that. And I think in doing that ongoing board training, I wouldn't just focus on your sector and your nonprofit, but also using this as an opportunity to inform your board about things that are happening outside of just your organization, so that they can be more strategic and have a broader set of perspectives. But the onboarding piece, and you should consider looking at sort of the process that you have in place now when you bring a new board member. It really sets the tone. It sets the tone of how delighted you are to have that person join you, the type of culture, and we're going to talk about culture in just a moment. But I think it really is important to create the right climate for success. One-on-one check-ins. I know a number of you practice, where you might have a board individual contract or set of expectations that a board member will fill out on an annual basis. Board Source, has templates for these, and I think it's a terrific tool. But I don't encourage any group to over-rely on the written document. I think the one-on-one check-ins are really important to know where board members are coming from and to ensure that they're engaged beyond just what is on maybe the expectation sheet when they sign up. Life changes, things evolve and adapt, and I think that that's important. Also tied to sort of best ideas in my mind for board engagement is to be specific, and I think this is sometimes hard for a professional staff member to do. It's hard for the ED to do, but it's even harder if you have a director of development or a staff member that interacts with the board. And that is this idea to be specific. What are we asking the board member to commit to? And one of the areas that I see sometimes a misalignment is that board members want to help, but they're not explicitly clear what is being asked of them. And that comes then to this idea of communicate, communicate, and communicate. I hear EDs come to me and say, "God, I wrote the board, but nobody ever responded to my email. I said something at the last board meeting and nobody ever asked a question." You have to repeat things multiple times for it to get through. You have to repeat things multiple times for it to get through. I see it across the board. Use different channels of communication, but it's vital. Be adaptable. All of us know that this week, and I'm afraid probably the weeks ahead. Life happens. So a board member with the best of intent when they signed up maybe has something going on that they can't be that way the next year. Be adaptable as an organization and be prepared for that. Don't write a board member off because they've had a bad quarter or a bad month. So with that, the last piece I'm going to talk and then jump into the fundraising is culture. And culture eats strategy for breakfast. Peter Drucker, a well-known management consultant, said that. I did a retreat once with an organization, and before I showed this slide, someone said, we were talking about strategy. They said, culture eats strategy for lunch. And I said, no, it's actually breakfast. So it's really important, the culture of an organization. Board culture impacts how board members relate to each other, how they relate to the staff, and how they relate to their board work. The absence of a culture presents challenges and it results, in your results and the overall collegiality. I do think that it's a hard thing to put my finger exactly on to tell you how to create the culture, but capturing people's hearts and creating a positive, productive culture through that constructive engagement, having the right people on the bus, and the practices that you put in place really can be your organization's secret sauce. It can really be what sets you apart. And all of these are critical elements to enhancing board engagement. And a negative culture will keep a board struggling. It will create disruption. It will manifest itself in staff leaving, in turnover. And if you remember back to that first chart of having your organization be in that dysfunctional place. Some quick thoughts, listening attentively and being respectful of each other. getting to know people as people and not just as colleagues. And I think in the nonprofit sector, we're often given that opportunity. This third point I feel strongly about, and there are times people say, trust me. And they believe that when we ask questions, it somehow means that I don't trust you. And I think that's a disservice to our roles as volunteer board members and as professional staff, and that we want to build a spirit of inquiry. We want the best ideas to rise to the top, and we want people to be inquisitive. And really important is that we're thinking about this always of advancing the interest of the organization over our personal agenda. We've all worked in organizations where people can't take off their hat of their personal agenda over the organization's interest, and we don't want to see that take place. And by sharing a clear vision, by having a vision statement, by having a strategic plan, it gives us an inspired, ambitious, aspirational place to work with enthusiasm and commitment. Without that strategic plan, I find there's often a lot of tactical work that's being done, and we're not in alignment on that clear vision, and that's so critical. And the last piece I'm going to say before I jump into sort of then what the power of this engaged board is, be sure, hopefully you're seeing the fireworks. Be sure to celebrate. It's so easy to look at the to-do list and to realize that not everything got accomplished. It's so easy to be held back because we didn't accomplish all of the goals we set out to the 100% mark. Celebrate. As volunteers, it's abundantly important that we take time for that. And as paid staff, it's critically important. All right. Any questions before we move on?
Yeah, so we have one question that is, our board often talks about getting together for social gatherings outside of board meetings. Seems like that would be good for culture generally, but it never happens. Should staff take on the logistics of setting that up, do you think?
Maybe I think it is a good idea. Don't overdo it. Maybe do it in lieu of a board meeting at some point, or shorten a board meeting if extra time is the problem. Maybe staff could work in partnership with the board chair to help make it easier to do. They could do it for them, but maybe in tandem would be the better approach.
Okay, great. And so we had a request to show the previous slide. So I'm just going to go back a little bit.
Okay.
Positive culture, if that person needs a few more moments there. We also had someone ask, and there are some questions about recruitment that I figured we could cover towards the end.
Yeah.
I'd like to cover those now, but we had one person ask, what should our board do in response to the COVID-19? If you have any current suggestions.
What should the board do?
Yeah, if there's anything that your board should be doing right now.
Well, first of all, taking care of themselves. And as we're on this webinar now, this is a great communication tool for the board to get together and talk about, based on the nonprofit itself and their role in serving their population and develop a short-term action plan. And I would keep those all short-term. You can't over-communicate enough, but I think to check in with your board and to check in with your stakeholders would be really important. I would need to know more specifics to offer more specific counsel. Okay, yeah. So let's do the recruitment piece at the end, if that's all right. And if you'll jump us back then to sort of the powers of the benefits of an engaged board. And I think there's no substitute for an articulate, enthusiastic, and dedicated board member. Having this really provides an opportunity to have evangelists, and board members are your best evangelists. By being a board member and being an evangelist, you can do something that the staff can never do, and that is, as a volunteer, you add more, as a force multiplier, you add more opportunities to share the work that is being done. So critical that as evangelists, boards take that responsibility serious. It doesn't mean attending committee meetings. It doesn't mean checking off lists. It means really knowing about your organization so that you can talk about it. So know your elevator speech. go out into the community with pride and raise the organization's profile, because this is a group that you're giving time to, you're giving money to. As a board member, if all of you play this role, it really helps propel your organization to the forefront of the community's being top of mind. You're a tremendous opportunity. You have a tremendous opportunity to be a link between the organization community. Even the most talented marketing directors, directors of development, finance directors, executive directors that are busy and active and successful in their organization would benefit from those unique relationships that board members have, and that you can be a link between the organization and community. You can do that to help make introductions, but also to gather intelligence. I always found that when I worked at the B and when I worked at UC Davis, having outside points of view was tremendously helpful for our organization to get a sense of what's going on that is informal, that is frequent, and that is from a variety of points of view. And so that's a critical role that board members can play. And then to use your network to introduce your executive director, to introduce your staff to the community, so that they can begin to share in more detail the success and the stories of the organization that you both are so engaged in. And beyond being evangelists, let's cut to the real meat now. Board members are your best fundraisers. You can significantly increase your organization's ability to raise money. We know this through Big Day of Giving, but we know it beyond that. There's actually been research that's been done that shows even organizations that have a full-time development director, volunteers, when they are involved in the solicitation, it doesn't mean they have to be the one asking for money, but volunteers, when they are involved in the solicitation, get larger gifts than when it's staff only. And so having board members be involved in the fundraising can significantly increase the organization's ability to give money. I'm going to imagine that you've all heard this, that, board giving, one of the first things a board member can do is make a gift, and we want to ensure that we have 100% of board giving. It brings in necessary resources, it leads by example, it sets a tone. But there's also, again, research that shows that those who invest their time are more likely to invest their money and make meaningful gifts. And I saw this play true at the Mondavi Center, that the volunteers that were the friends of UC Davis Presents, or the friends of the Mondavi Center now, these are individuals that give time, but all of them give gifts, and they give larger gifts because of that volunteer involvement. The research shows it. And in fact, those of you who had the pleasure to know Barbara Jackson, as I did, who the Jackson Hall is named after her and her late, her and her husband, they both have passed away now, but she lived to be 100 years old. And Barbara used to run the gift shop there. She was an active volunteer. She was a founder of the Friends of UC Davis Presents. Those who invest their time are more likely to invest their money and make meaningful gifts. And the most powerful fundraising is peer-to-peer solicitation. I'm a big believer in having the executive director, the development director, be meeting with donors face-to-face and peer-to-peer, but having volunteers in that is particularly critical and particularly helpful. And so what are the roles of board members when it comes to fundraising? We talked about making a personal gift. Board members can identify prospects. Board members can make introductions. They can look at materials before they get printed and give feedback. Are the materials clear? Do they make a compelling case? Are they going to be understood? Have they answered the questions that investors or funders might want to know? And then this bullet here, solicit potential donors, which is, if we were meeting in person today, I would see all of your eyes probably glom right to. And this is what sets, I think, some board members off. They say to me, Steve, I don't want to solicit. I don't want to ask my family or friends for money. So I really don't think I'm going to be very effective in fundraising. And I listen to them. And I say, that's okay. You actually can still be exceptionally helpful in fundraising. And so I think it's important that we realize there's a wide range of things that individuals can do, board members can do. And I've gone through a list here. I've got another: cultivate, steward, repeat, continue that relationship. But only one of these items is solicit potential donors. And so there's plenty of opportunities to be involved in fundraising without actually making the ask, for those who are terrified at the prospect of asking a friend, a family, or worse yet, a stranger for money. And the last piece is thank donors. I was the board chair of KVIE, which is where we were supposed to meet today. And I was, as the board chair, making calls, as I did periodically, on a regular basis to thank donors. And I called an individual who I had never met. He was the CEO of a major business in the organization. He took my call. I was not calling to solicit for a gift, but I was calling to thank him. And in that time, I thanked him. I found out he knew more about public television and the KVIE schedule than I did, which left me a little embarrassed. But I got over my embarrassment. And at the end of that call, we arranged for him to take a tour of the station, something he had never done. His company ended up making larger gifts in subsequent years. He personally made larger gifts. He joined the board, and several years later, he was elected board chair, continuing to be involved with the station even to this day. It started with a random call to thank a donor, a cold call, someone I didn't even know. So those are ways that board members can be involved. Maybe some of you have seen this from K Sprinkle Grace. It's the first fundraising training I went to years ago in the 80s when I began my career at UC Davis, working in raising money. And so this idea of being a AAA board, and that is, you want board members to be advocates who are out there and raising the flag and advocating in a constructive way for your organization. You want board members to be ambassadors. You know what an ambassador does. They open doors, they cultivate, they conduct, liaison, they're stewards. This is a critical role for board members, and this helps the paid staff to have board members in these roles. And only the third role is asker. And usually we find a couple board members that with training and with encouragement move into that role and enjoy it. But not every board member needs to be an asker. The executive director can be an asker, the staff can be an asker, former board members. I think most boards will have an asker or two, but not everybody needs to be an asker. And so I would challenge you to look at your board and think through the training that they might need to be comfortable being advocates, ambassadors, and askers. Okay, we're coming to the end of my slides, and this is a photo that was taken actually recently at a fundraising for one of my clients, the Center for Land-Based Learning. I think we have one of their representatives actually on the call today, so congratulations, because they're in the last throes of a very successful capital campaign, and will be moving into a new headquarters in Woodland from Winters, California later this spring. But all of this in my mind comes together with this photo and this notion of engagement in action. I've worked with a lot of organizations that have been at different levels of activity and professional staff or volunteer, but we went through a process of being clear about expectations. We went through a process of looking at who are the right people on the bus. We went through a process of looking at how do we have constructive engagement, and then putting that marker down, putting a plan together to raise more funds, to engage the board in fundraising, recruiting other volunteers to help as the YOLO Food Bank did, or the Center for Land-Based Learning, to engage volunteers, former board members to step forward to help us be ambassadors, advocates, and ultimately askers to be successful at building board engagement. And the byproduct of that is being remarkably successful in raising more money. And with that, why don't I take a pause and see if there are some questions that you have before our time rapidly comes to a close.
Yes. So it looks like someone asked, how do you encourage board members to engage in active fundraising activities when they are interested in supporting the agency, but don't have experience or confidence in this area, especially with using social media and asking their networks for money? Any specific suggestions?
Training is the first piece to find out. A lot of people don't like to do this because they don't have that experience. They've never done it, or they've got misperceptions. And so a lot of the work that I do is to work with individual board members or the board as a full. There's books, there's consultants or former board members that can play this role, or current board members, but to do some training to help bolster their confidence, to share examples, to ask board members who have been successful at this in the past to share how they've done it.
So someone else asks, is it appropriate to ask board members to handwrite personal thank you notes for donors, particularly new board members that are not sure how to add value?
Absolutely. Handwritten notes in this day of social media, to your last question, I think are even more important. And for a board member to say, I'm new, I'm on the board, and we just found out that you made a significant gift to our organization. I can't tell you how important that is and how grateful I am. Thank you very much. When I was on the Capitol Public Radio Board, we made phone calls to donors as well, and that's also, don't lose sight of the human touch. Snap a photo on your iPhone and send it to donors, thanking them and letting them see in action their gift coming to life.
So someone asked, how do you build the spirit of inquiry?
You build the spirit of inquiry by being very intentional about setting the ground rules of how we're going to conduct our meetings, and working to build a sense of trust. It might require a board retreat or some discussion outside of just a board meeting, and it also needs to be modeled by the behavior of the executive director and the professional staff.
Great. And if Steve, I don't think we necessarily have to have a hard stop at 10. I think if you're available, I know that we have about one more minute, but we do have some questions about recruitment if you wanted to get into that.
Sure, that would be fine. Yeah, if people do need to get off, I can certainly stay beyond the 10 o'clock, but I know people have busy lives and even busier weeks to bring close to. I want to extend my thanks for those who made the time and joined us. We could have spent all day with the topics that we had, and certainly being in person would have allowed us to have more of a give and take. And so I'm sorry that the medium didn't allow us to connect as we might have on a personal basis. But I wanted to extend my thanks for all of you for making the time, and certainly to salute you for the work that you're doing. The nonprofit sector is one I believe in greatly, and the work that you do is vitally important to that today and tomorrow, even more important than it was yesterday.
Great.
Happy to take those questions you have.
Yeah, and also before we, if anyone does need to jump off before then, real quick, I wanted to point out our board, or our panel on board engagement, for simplicity's sake, is not going to happen today, but they wanted to provide their emails if you wanted to reach out to any of them. We have Jim Tabucci from Sacramento Mandarins, Tanya Goins from First Tee, who's also one of our mentors, so you can also find her in the mentor search, and Gary Strong, CEO of American Red Cross. So they wanted to provide their information in case you wanted to reach out for more information. And with that, I'll go back to questions. And also just to, for those asking about getting a copy of the PowerPoint, I will put a copy of the slide decks up in the resource tab shortly after this. So Steve, just to get into those questions that we have about recruitment, someone asked how to recruit strong and connected board members, if you have any suggestions around that.
Yeah, this is, it'll take probably a little more detail to go into, but let me broadly put a few comments out there. one is what type of board members do we need to help round out the kind of conversations that we want to have to be successful carrying out our mission. So to be clear on those attributes, those professional attributes, those personal characteristics, those skill sets, demographic to provide assurances of representation. And once the board has decided that, then I think to begin to look at who are the best people that could help fill those seats on the bus, and to start at the top, to make big asks, to be bold. The worst case is someone will say no. In almost every instance, they'll be flattered that they were asked, and you might surprise yourself and get a yes. Worst case, you might get a I'll think about it, or you could reapproach them in a couple years from now. And in the very worst case, you might have just done some stewarding of a relationship that could result in some ongoing financial contributions to your organization. And then the other piece of this is, I think, board members then want to look at their leverage, their network, and leverage that network to think of the types of people that have a familiarity with the cause, that relate and resonate with the cause. People give to people with causes, and so even I've worked with a lot of groups that people maybe haven't been involved with the cause of the organization before, but they care passionately about the sort of they have an affinity for those sort of things that their friends are involved with, or they have an affinity with a cause that's similar. And so it requires reaching out and asking. It's much like fundraising. You're going to get some no's, and don't be intimidated by that, but engage in a thoughtful process and recruit a list, identify a list of names, and then go after and recruit, and think about the best person to ask that person to join your board. Just like fundraising, who's the best person to make the ask? And so I would be thoughtful about this. And for some boards, that's a lot of effort and a lot of energy, but I think it pays big dividends.
Great. We have one person asking, is it appropriate to have government officials on your board, i.e. city council members or state legislatures? Our organization is part of the UC system, University of California.
Yeah, I'm a Go Ags. I'm a UC alum. You have to look at your own individual bylaws and conflicts of interest, but in general, I say yes. The only piece that I would say is my personal experience has been in most of those instances that electeds are on boards, they haven't been as helpful in fundraising as the board had initially thought or hoped when they recruited them, because for those who are running for office periodically or perpetually, that seems to be their driving focus for raising money. I don't want to generalize for all electeds, but that had been my experience. But I think to have a well-rounded board, and as part of that, I also would recruit some folks that maybe aren't going to be as helpful specifically in raising money, but are going to bring other attributes and assets to the organization.
Great. Well, it looks like we are good on questions now. Maybe if anyone has any last questions, speak now. But I will let you know.
Fair enough. So let me end with,
here, I'll get you back.
Perfect. There's an image of these beautiful snow geese flying over the Yolo Causeway, and I did some work with the Yolo Basin Foundation. This is an organization that they weren't ready to launch a capital campaign, but they were having a 25th anniversary, and their founding director was stepping down, and so we launched a $1.5 million campaign to sort of celebrate the organization and envision the future. But the story is not about the success of that fundraising campaign and how it propelled them forward. It's the beautiful imagery of these snow geese that fly in this V formation. And there has been extensive research that's been done, aside from the affinity, the beautiful aesthetic of this. Flying in this V formation allows this whole flock to fly about 70% further with the same amount of energy as if a single goose were to fly alone. And so it, I think, is a great metaphor of if we can build this alignment, this constructive partnership, and focused on the work of our organization and our mission. I think for each of our organizations, we can be more successful, we can flow more effortlessly and achieve the results. And so I hope that that imagery leaves you with that inspiration and viewpoint. And at the end of the day, there's a quote from the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Judith Rodin, that I really like. What endures from the work of nonprofits is not how hard we work, how clever we may be, or even how much we care. Ultimately, what is remembered is how we have been able to improve lives. And so with that, thank you very much. And I enjoyed the opportunity to spend some time together this morning.
Thank you so much, Steve. We did have one last question that came in, and it was someone asking if you would recommend them sharing what they learned in this presentation with their board, or if, maybe in terms of board engagement and things like calling bad board members, that might be something that you wouldn't necessarily want to talk with your board about.
Well, I don't think anybody's a bad board member. There might be folks that in the state that they're at, they're not fully contributing their full potential. So let me start there. But no, I think, I'm a big believer to share information. That's why I'm doing this today. I'm a big believer in, we want to have a meaningful, honest dialogue. It has to be in the right context, it has to be at the right time and with the right people. And so I want to encourage thoughtfulness about that. But I think in that spirit of building board engagement, it can only happen by having that sort of dialogue. And whether this conversation we've had this morning, although far more one way than I had desired, but better than no conversation. And I salute the Region Community Foundation for continuing to advance the dialogue, because it's evergreen. It's going to be critical as it was when they planned it, as it will be in a year from now. That I hope that today's conversation allows you to have some ideas and thoughts, whether you're the board member, whether you're the professional staff member. We all have a critical role to help become a high-performing board and to facilitate increased board engagement, because that will manifest itself in more success, not just on Big Day of Giving, but throughout the year in all of the work we're doing to raise money and support for the nonprofits we care so deeply about.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. We got several comments just to share with you about how much people got out of this presentation and how great it was, and I just wanted to echo that. So thank you again so much for joining us, and thanks for everyone who attended. I know this was a different format than we were intending, but just like you, we're working on being flexible as things move on. So thank you all so much again. Thank you so much, Steve, for your time and your expertise on this topic.
Thank you. Stay well, stay healthy.
Okay, well, thank you all, and we will talk with you all soon. Okay, bye.